Our first speaker tonight is Anne Coombs, author and activist. Some of you will know Anne's book, Sex and Anarchy, The Life and Death of the Sydney Push, or her controversial novel, Broom Time, that she wrote with her partner, Susan Varga. Or you might know Anne as the founder of Rural Australians for Refugees, or as the chair of Get Up, of whom you may have heard. This evening, Anne will be considering the question, what is government for? Please welcome Anne Coombs.
Mark has a great line that he uses: disruption is everywhere except politics. We've become so accustomed to hearing politicians talk about an acceptable range of subjects in an acceptable way. It's led to a narrowing of political discussion and political vision. And the result is that most people simply switch off. Instead of planning for the future or protecting things of national importance, adapting to the many challenges facing the world, our politicians have spent the past decade playing the old games and mouthing the same platitudes. Sure, people have always complained about their governments, but the level of dissatisfaction now suggests a deeper malaise. There's a growing realisation that much of the power we have given governments has been handed over to corporate interests. The selling off of public assets is part of this, but not the most insidious. For example, government subsidies to fossil fuel companies at a time when the rest of the world is turning away from coal makes no sense, yet we seem powerless to stop it. The bottom line is that governments are meant to look after our interests. There's some basic human necessities: food, shelter, security, and we've given governments a great deal of power in order to have these basic requirements met. The power to tax, for example. Without that, they can do nothing. But with that power comes the responsibility to plan. Planning not just for today or the next 3 years, but for prosperity into the future. And that is something that Australian governments have not been very good at. Even getting the basic infrastructure right seems to be beyond us, evident in the transport and urban planning nightmares that are our major cities. This wasn't always the case. Look at the Sydney Harbour Bridge. The designers of the bridge in the 1920s showed remarkable forethought. Its 8 lanes must have seemed enormous in 1932. It took 70 years to pay off the Harbour Bridge debt, a public asset publicly built and paid for. The next time government took on something so ambitious was Labor's plan for the National Broadband Network. And what a mess that turned into once it became a political football. The Turnbull government talked a great deal about transitioning. But what did it mean? In hindsight, nothing. Having signed the Paris climate deal, it then failed to put in place policies that would reduce greenhouse emissions. Now the Morrison government continues to sprout that we will meet our Paris targets at a canter, against plentiful evidence that our greenhouse emissions have actually increased. This reality vacuum, the disjunction between rhetoric and action, is becoming increasingly common. Other countries make decisions about the kind of economic development that will be of benefit to them and introduce policies that will make it happen. For example, South Korea with the steel and car industries, or Spain with renewable energy. But in Australia, our governments live in a neoliberal fantasy world where the market is expected to do it. What Spain has done with renewables, Australia could and should have been doing for a decade or more. It's this, not just inaction, but antagonism towards renewables, that is most frustrating. It is said that the principal reason for the coalition's attitude is the donations it receives from the fossil fuel industry. Could it be as simple and blatant as that? Probably. And what of the Murray-Darling Basin, Why does the National Party seem most concerned to pander to the interests of the big agribusiness irrigators? Could it be the same reason? The National Party has long since lost the right to see itself as defender of the battlers of the bush. The Water Act of 2007 might have saved the river, but has been chipped away at by vested interests until now we have what we've seen in the recent fish kills. We should not be growing rice or cotton on the scale we are, and a government with guts would put an end to it. But politicians with no interest beyond the next election seem to care little for the environmental legacy they are leaving. What, for example, is happening to our cities? Rapid population growth, unaffordable housing, congested roads and fraying social cohesion. Refugees become the scapegoats when these problems have little to do with them. Rather, government policy that has allowed hundreds of thousands of new arrivals to come on business visas or dodgy working visas or student visas, sometimes fraudulently, often through tin pot institutions. That has encouraged the education sector to become a factory for processing overseas students, sometimes fraudulently and sometimes through tin pot institutions. It's a government that has allowed Sydney and Melbourne to become the real estate bolt hole for wealthy overseas buyers. All this has been going on under our noses these past 15 years, with no consultation between government and the Australian people. One of the reasons I believe that the major parties get away with what they get away with is that our attention has become atomised. We go into bat for particular issues, saving the Great Barrier Reef, protecting inner city neighbourhoods from motorways, stopping Adani, a fair go for asylum seekers, all important issues. But meanwhile, the runaway train that leads to the future careens on, driverless. And its carriages are filled with those millions of Australians who have very little say over how their lives unfold, who are just getting by. Government should be driving that train. The shortness of the federal election cycle is one of the reasons we get such inept governance. A referendum to establish fixed 4-year terms should be a priority. No government can plan or implement good policy with an election every 2 or 3 years. When government is working well, you barely notice it. And we've been lucky in this country that that has quite often been the case. But what is so dismaying at the moment is that we can all see around us things that need to be done and that are not being done. Some serious policies to tackle climate change and the degradation of our environment, saving our rivers, providing affordable homes, a modern and efficient and comprehensive national rail network. Instead, what we are seeing on multiple fronts is a failure to plan and implement policies for the future. That is what governments are for. And this failure on the environment, on transport, on energy policy, the list goes on, this failure is one of the principal reasons people are so dissatisfied with government. People are fed up with the perverted form of democracy that we currently have, whereby candidates are selected by a handful of people in the major parties, and we are then expected to vote for them. And when they get into Parliament, they take far more notice of party bosses and big donors than they do of their constituents, or even of their consciences. One of the things that is heartening in what Mark is trying to do with Together is putting the idea of our commonwealth front and centre stage. He's not just tinkering around the edges with a few policy ideas and pet projects. He's trying to reimagine and rebalance what government can and should be doing for us. Much that is wrong with our current situation can be laid at the door of the great God competition, that neoliberal talisman. We need to reassert the value of public institutions and public ownership and public service, and insist that politicians stop seeing us as consumers and start seeing us as citizens. Yes. Thanks.